The case we are going to discuss today is perhaps the most vile and cruel I've encountered in the last year, that's for sure. It's hard to believe such stories can really happen, but this story is saturated not only with cruelty, it strikes more with those unexpected plot twists that occurred as it developed. The story begins in the small town of Kuzim, a town with a population of about 10,000 people. It is located in a country we haven't visited before in our stories, the Czech Republic. What is this town famous for? Well, first and foremost, for this amazing and brutal story that we will talk about today. On May 7th, 2007, a man named Edward was completely absorbed in family matters. A significant event had occurred in his life. A child was born to him. The man's wife and child were still in the maternity hospital, and his task was to prepare the house for their return. Well, you know, to tidy up, decorate the house, assemble the crib, and so on. And the last thing on his to-do list was to figure out how the baby monitor works. Or, as it's commonly called, a baby monitor. It's a device for remote monitoring of a child. It includes a camera, and a baby monitor camera is placed next to the child's crib, and parents, even when in another room, can remotely watch the child on the monitor, which receives the signal from the camera in the child's room. Edward's task was to set up the monitor to receive the signal. At first, the monitor only showed so-called white noise from his camera. However, over time, Edward managed to pick up the signal from the camera, and a clear image appeared on the screen. The camera was positioned opposite the baby crib that the man had recently assembled, of course. On the monitor screen, Edward was supposed to see her. However, to his great surprise, he saw something completely different. On the monitor screen was a child whom Edward had never seen before. It was no longer an infant. He was approximately 6 to 8 years old. The child looked a bit tired. At the same time, he was naked and was in some strange room. Why did Edward see this image? Well, the point is that the man's monitor accidentally caught a signal not from his camera, but from a camera located in the vicinity of his house. In other words, from someone's camera. Edward's neighbors. The man didn't attach much importance to what he saw, especially since the image then switched to Edward's camera. Now he saw what he was supposed to see initially, his house. On top of that, Edward's wife called from the maternity hospital, which also, it distracted him a little from what he saw, it's true, but later the man's thoughts eventually returned to the strange picture he had witnessed. He went back to the monitor and began checking adjacent frequencies again. In the end, he managed to catch the signal from the neighbor's video camera again. The child was in the same place. What, which already looked strange a few hours ago, was that someone seemed to be holding a child locked up under camera surveillance. However, the longer Edward watched the monitor, the more frightening the situation became. Soon the man noticed that the child's hands were tied, that he was very dirty, and what the child is eating from the floor. Realizing the gravity of what he saw, fearing the signal might be lost, the man pressed the video record button. Edward was extremely frightened. Of course, he soon called the police. Edward showed the recording on the monitor to the police officers. As has already been said, the image appeared on the monitor from a neighbor's camera. It's true, Edward didn't recognize the child in the video, nor did he know any neighbors who might have had a child of roughly the same age. So the police had only one option left, to check every neighboring house. In one of the first houses on the list, the police were met by two women, 30-year-old Klara Mauer and her older sister, 32-year-old Katarina Mauer. Klara was a teacher, and Katarina worked at a local childcare center. The video showed a boy, so the police were looking for a child exactly like that. Klara and Katarina said that yes, a child does indeed live in their home, but only a 13-year-old girl, Klara's adopted daughter, named Anichka, or simply Anna. Nevertheless, the police asked the sisters to inspect their home, but to their surprise, Klara refused. She explained that her adopted daughter was sick and would be extremely frightened to see strangers in the house. The police insisted on their request anyway. Sisters Klara and Katarina were forced to let them in. Once inside, the police couldn't understand why the sisters had resisted so much. During the house inspection, everything seemed normal. The police didn't even cross paths with Klara's 13-year-old daughter, which is what the woman was so worried about. However, a few minutes later, something suspicious was found. There was a locked door at the back of the house. Judging by the layout, it led to the basement. This is encouraging, exactly what the police were looking for. They asked the sisters to open the door, to which they replied that they rent this house. The basement door is locked by the owner. They never opened this door, and only the owner of the house has the keys. The police treated such an explanation with disbelief, but nevertheless left Klara and Katerina's house. They returned to Edward's house, who continued to record what was happening with the child on screen. The police rewound the recording, and after watching it, they heard the same music that a few minutes ago they heard in the house of sisters Klara and Katerina. Moreover, soon they heard their own voices. And this meant only one thing. The tormented child in the video was indeed in the house recently inspected by police. The house of Klara and Katerina. Of course, the police are here. Returned to the sisters' house and demanded that the women open the cellar door. At that moment, Klara's previously mentioned adopted daughter, 13-year-old Anna, emerged from her room. To the police, she looked clearly younger than her 13 years, at least in terms of development. She behaved like a baby, crawled on all fours screaming, "Mom, Mom," and eventually clung to her Aunt Katerina like a small child. The police drew the only logical conclusion from what they saw. 13-year-old Anna probably had a developmental delay, or something like that. Eventually, the police had to break down the door leading to the basement. As soon as the door opened, the police smelled a terrible stench from below. In the dark, dirty, damp basement was the very boy the police had seen on the baby monitor screen, but now, in person, the scene looked much worse than on the small monitor screen. The conditions in which the child was kept were simply terrible. He was dirty, almost naked, his hands were tied, food was scattered all over the floor, and the floor itself was very cold. And the child, judging by everything, slept precisely on this concrete, terribly cold floor. But this was not all that shocked the police. The rescued child was not alone. The first child, the one who initially appeared on video, was 8-year-old Andrei. In addition to him, in the basement, there was also his 6-year-old brother, Yakov. Both of these boys were the sons of one of Klara's sisters. Both women, the children's mother Klara and her sister Katerina, were immediately arrested. The police asked Klara why the children were in the basement, to which Klara mysteriously replied, "Whatever I answer now, you won't understand anyway." The logical question arose: what the hell was going on in this house? As soon as the discovery of the children became known, the small town of Korum found itself at the center of public attention. This story was met with a degree of horror and bewilderment. Why would someone inflict such pain on their own children, literally push them to the brink of survival? This was the question whose answer had yet to be established. And if you think that all the most cruel and unexpected has already been said, believe me, everything said earlier is just the beginning. 3 children, Andrei, Yakov, and Anna, were moved to an orphanage. Although the 2 boys had endured terrible physical suffering, they behaved quite calmly and friendly. During the initial examination, scars were also found on their bodies. Admittedly, they were not as fresh as those on the boys' bodies. Judging by her not entirely healthy behavior, she clearly suffered more, not physically, but rather morally. However, further in this story, another unexpected turn occurred. 13-year-old Anna simply disappeared from the orphanage, and it wasn't quite straightforward. To put it correctly, the fact is that for a child in the state Anna was in, it would have been extremely difficult to escape from the orphanage, and this meant one thing. She was most likely kidnapped by someone, of course. Massive searches for this vulnerable teenage girl immediately began. Parallel to this, psychologists and police began working with Andrei, Yakov, Klara, and Ekaterina. Eventually, the police managed to get an approximate picture of what happened, a truly terrible one. At first, things weren't so bad, quite the opposite. Klara was a wonderful mother to her sons. Andrei and Yakov never really needed anything. They did sports, went to summer camps, went to school. Klara took care of them. True, Klara sometimes had a difficult relationship with the boy's father, mainly because Klara and her sister Katerina were deeply religious. Each of the sisters believed she had a special mission appointed by God. Her husband did not share Klara's views, which led to frequent arguments, sometimes even fights, and eventually led to divorce. Yet Klara's strange worldview never reflected on the children, Andrei and Yakov. As has already been said, she always treated them with great love and care. However, as you understand, at some point everything changed. In mid-2005, Klara visited her sister Katerina. At that time, they did not yet live together with her. Klara discovered with surprise in her sister's house a 13-year-old. She said this girl happened to be at the children's center where Katerina worked, and this girl's fate was extremely difficult. Anna was an orphan from Norway. Both her parents were alcoholics, and in her childhood, she experienced a lot of bullying from them. Soon, Anna's parents died, and she ended up in sex slavery with human traffickers. She was sold from one owner to another in different European countries, so she eventually ended up in the Czech Republic. Here in the Czech Republic, she miraculously managed to escape. So she ended up at the children's center with Katerina. Having learned about Anna's difficult fate, Katerina periodically started taking her home. Klara also felt pity for Anna. She started seeing her more and more often. And Katerina began to notice that after spending time with Klara, Anna's mood it was getting better. Eventually, Klara suggested that Anna move in with her. Over time, Klara began to accept and care for Anna as her own child. Later, Katerina also moved in with her sister and her children, so they all started living in one house: Klara, Katerina, Anna, and Andrei. And Yakov, truly, Anna's problems were not limited to a difficult childhood. It turned out she had a number of serious illnesses: leukemia, kidney failure, vision, and hearing problems. Fortunately, Katerina managed to find the right doctor who agreed to take Anna for treatment. About once a week, Katerina and Anna went to see this doctor. However, Klara herself met with him only once. It happened one evening in the hospital parking lot. It was so dark that Klara couldn't even make out the doctor's face. Nevertheless, he showed her his Anna's diploma, and medical documents dispelled the distrust and doubts Klara had about his person after this meeting. All further communication between Klara and the doctor was via SMS messages. The doctor prescribed various treatments and procedures for Anna, some quite strange. Procedures Anna was supposed to feel comfortable and rest often, and Klara was supposed to give her a full-body massage. The doctor especially emphasized that it was important to also massage intimate body parts. According to him, this should have made Anna happier. Klara, without hesitating, she followed all the doctor's instructions. However, the doctor soon said that the treatment wasn't helping much. Anna's hearing, kidney, and heart problems worsened. This focused Klara's attention on Anna even more. At the same time, Klara's interest in her own children, Andrei and Yakov, began to wane. They spent more and more time with their grandparents, and Klara became more and more devoted to Anna, deciding to finally officially adopt her. But Anna's doctor told Klara that this was impossible. According to him, the reason was that the son's Klara is jealous of Anna, and generally, as he believed, the future held nothing but prison for Andrei and Yakov. Therefore, he advised Klara to seriously take up their upbringing, to do so with all strictness, as he put it, to deliver the boys from evil spirits. This was supposed to involve physical punishment and strict discipline for Anna's well-being. Klara unconditionally followed all the doctor's instructions. She started beating the boys for any, even the most minor offenses. It often seemed like she herself was looking for a reason to punish. In addition to beatings, Klara sometimes deprived the boys of food, even when they behaved appropriately. However, despite all of Klara's efforts, the doctor remained dissatisfied with the result. In August 2006, the doctor wrote to Klara that the punishments were not effective enough. He expressed, "Shock therapy is needed." At this stage, the story becomes maximally disgusting and cruel. The doctor ordered Klara to completely stop treating the boys like a mother. He said they needed to be taken to a remote hut in the forest. Once again, Klara followed his instructions. She took her sons to a secluded hut near the village of Wyverstishka. There, Klara and her sons were already awaited by Anna Katerina, and 3 people not yet mentioned in this story. A woman named Hanna Basova, as well as 2 men, Jan Škrla and Jan Turek. All 3 were acquaintances of Katarina. They worked at the same children's center as she did. The shock therapy for the boys began immediately upon arrival. They were placed in a cramped dog cage. They spent most of their time in this cage while they could only stand on their knees. They ate from dog bowls and had to use the toilet, were forced into this very same cramped cell. Boys were strictly forbidden to talk to each other or indeed to anyone present in the hut. The boys were only let out of the cell for torture. They were forced to fight each other, burned with cigarette butts, beaten with sticks and belts. They were scratched with knives, plunged into. Boys had black, dense bags, mouths taped shut with Scotch tape, and the children's arms and legs were tied. But the torture was not only physical. At night, children were placed in dug graves for a while, not allowed to sleep, and insulted in every way. All this lasted for 8 days. Well, and the most something terrible happened exactly on the 8th, the last day. Then the sadists completely crossed all, even the most unthinkable boundaries. Andrei was dragged out of the cage and thrown onto the floor. His mother Klara took out a knife and cut off a piece of flesh from his buttocks. The piece of cut meat was passed around, and each of those present was forced to take a bite of the piece. They forced Yakov to eat it. After 8 days of this hell, Klara, Katarina, Anna, Andrei, and Yakov returned home. But as we already know, the torture of the boys did not end there. Klara began to lock the boys in the basement of the house more and more often. During that period, Klara decided to finally complete Anna's adoption process. However, Anna had almost no documents, which significantly complicated things. Using her connections, Katarina managed to bypass these legal obstacles. A series of forged documents were made, and instead of Anna, apparently another girl appeared, the daughter of a local actor who was paid for it. It worked, and the court eventually approved the procedure. Klara officially became Anna's mother. The abuse of the children continued for almost 8 months until May 7, 2007, when Edward accidentally caught a signal from the camera in Klara and Katarina's house. As we already know, the women were eventually arrested, and the boys and Anna were sent to an orphanage from which Anna disappeared just a couple of days later. A little over 6 months passed since these events, and in another country in Norway, in the city of Oslo, a child also disappeared from an orphanage. A 13-year-old boy named Adam. He hadn't spent much time in the orphanage, only a month. Initially, he came to the orphanage himself, saying that his father was abusing him and even sexually assaulting him. Well, after his disappearance, extensive searches began. The boy Adam was eventually found a month later in another Norwegian city, Tromsø. However, upon finding Adam, the police made an unexpected discovery. It was not a boy at all, but a girl. It was the very girl who had gone missing from the orphanage in Anna, from the Czech Republic, somehow ended up in Norway, where she pretended to be a boy who was abused by his parents. In January 2008, she was returned to the Czech Republic. By this time, Czech police knew a little more about 13-year-old Anna. Anna, this wasn't her real name, is actually Barbora Škrlova. Oh yes, and one more important nuance, she was not 13 years old, but 33. Yes, as surprising as it may sound, Anna, who was considered 13, was actually older than Klara, the woman who adopted her. Probably at this stage, it would be more correct to stop. Her Anna, we will subsequently call her by her real name, Barbara. After the case received huge media coverage, photos and video footage of all its participants were, of course, shown everywhere. Well, and given that immediately after the children's release, Barbara, whom everyone still perceived as Anna, disappeared. It was precisely her photo that appeared most frequently in the press. It was then that the police began to receive unexpected calls. Barbara was recognized by the staff of the Children's Center where Katarina worked. It turned out that Barbara also worked there once. The truth is, only until 2003. After that, she quit, and Katarina started telling everyone Barbara had died. Except she, of course, didn't die. She began preparing a new identity for herself as a teenage girl. This was largely successful for her thanks to a rare disease that slowed her down. Physical development, so indeed, with proper preparation, Barbara could successfully pass herself off as a teenager. But why all this? For what reason? Why? And this is perhaps the most difficult part of this story. Barbara was also arrested, of course, but unlike everyone else. Not child abuse of others, but only the article on failure to report a crime. That is, it means she knew about all the mistreatment that others were inflicting on Andrei and Yakov, but did not report it to the authorities. And anyway, Barbara said that she was just as much a victim of everything that happened as Andrei and Yakov. And there was indeed evidence of this on Barbara's body, just as the boys' bodies had many scars and cigarette burn marks. Klara, the woman who adopted Barbara, could not believe until the end that Barbara was not 13, but a full 20 years older, 33 years old. It took the police quite some time, photos and documents for Klara to finally grasp the reality. When Klara understood what was going on, she remembered that she had actually met Barbara before she started posing as a 13-year-old. She spoke and behaved differently then. She didn't look like a child. Klara couldn't imagine that. Yes, the Barbara she once knew and Anna were one and the same person. Apparently, realizing how cruelly and deeply she had been deceived, Klara, who had kept silent until then, began to reveal new information about Barbara. According to Klara, no one had bullied Barbara at all. On the contrary, she herself took full part in bullying the boys. Here, of course, the question arises, where did the marks on her own body then come from? Barbara's scars and burns. Their presence was explained fairly quickly. As for the cigarette burns, their number increased upon re-examination of Barbara's body, and this meant Barbara was being cauterized. Regarding the scars, they weren't sustained as a result of torture, or these were scars from plastic surgery. To look even more like a child, Barbara reduced her breasts and had liposuction, removed fat deposits. In other words, oh yes, Barbara also claimed she had been raped, but again, the examination showed she was a virgin. Now that the prosecutor has grounds to accuse Barbara of child abuse, her story changed slightly. She did admit to participating in the abuse, but only because she was forced to do it, according to Barbara, Katerina, and Hanna Basova. They forced her to do it, threatening that if she refused, she herself would join the boys in the cage. According to Barbara, it was Hanna and Katerina who were responsible for everything that happened. Barbara admitted that she had indeed known both Katerina and Hanna for quite a long time, and it was these women convinced Barbara to pose as a 13-year-old, even drugging her to affect her psyche. And the cherry on top of this entire horrific story, I remind you that Klara was receiving SMS instructions from a certain doctor. This doctor was the one forcing Klara regarding cruel treatment of her sons. So it actually turned out that no doctor, of course, existed. And the message was written by Klara's sister, Katerina, and Barbora Skrlova. On June 17, 2008, the trial began for all participants in this case. Klara Mauer, Katerina Mauer, Hanna Basova, Jan Turk, Jan Školoj, and Barbora Škrlová. The latter two incidentally turned out to be brother and sister. Of all six, only one person admitted guilt. Who do you think? It's not hard to guess it was the boy's mother, Klara. Each of the defendants underwent psychological tests, all six of them. Certain psychological problems concerning Klara were identified. It was concluded that all her emotions are exaggerated. She is easily influenced, cannot live without the support of other people, is highly dependent on the opinions of others, and in almost every matter needs approval from others. In other words, she is very easy to manipulate. All the others had clear sadistic tendencies, a desire to dominate someone or to manipulate the opinions of other people. This particularly applied to Katerina. She also additionally, a tendency towards pedophilia was revealed in everyone. Here, you could say everything coincided. One of the sisters, Klara, was easily susceptible to external influence, while the second, Katerina, on the contrary, sought to manipulate the opinions of others. Thus, the main culprit of everything that happened really seemed to be Katerina was silent for a long time. She didn't voice her versions. But closer to the end, she finally started talking. In her words, she had known Barbara for quite a long time. First, she studied with her and then worked. All this time, she felt sorry for Barbara. She seemed somewhat clumsy, not adapted to adult. Katerina understood that Barbara clearly needed someone's care. Katerina tried her best to give Barbara that care, and then, at least according to Katerina, a pure accident happened. Klara came to visit her and saw Barbara there. She mistook her for a child, and Katerina simply decided to play along with her, because as Katerina thought, Klara was exactly the person who could take care of Barbara, who was absolutely unadapted to life, and whom Katerina could undoubtedly manipulate. But this in no way justifies her behavior, and of course, she, just like everyone else, was to be punished. On October 25, 2008, sentences were announced. Barbora Škrlova, 5 years, Jan Turek, 5 years, Jan Škrlova, 7 years, Hanna Basova, 7 years, Klara Mauerova, 9 years, Katerina Mauer, 10 years of imprisonment. As you understand, all these terms have already passed. All participants in this case are already free. How at the same time, almost every one of them actually served less than they were given. After release, Klara resumed contact with her family. She was allowed to see her children, but not live with them. Custody of the boys was transferred to their grandparents. Katerina, on the other hand, cut off all contact with her family. Nothing is known about her further fate. Barbara changed her name after release. Her time in prison aggravated her mental state. She was even given a disability. Well, everything said earlier is the official version of events. The version in which a group of sadists tortured children simply because each of them was mentally ill and had a propensity for it. But there's another unofficial version of this whole story. And in it, perhaps the main culprit of everything that happened bore no responsibility at all. Previously, I mentioned that no doctor existed in this story, that all communication in the doctor's name was conducted by Katerina and Barbara. But you surely also remember that Klara once had a meeting in the hospital parking lot with a person who introduced himself as doctor. Well, such a meeting did happen. This person was certainly not a doctor. His name was Joseph Škrlova. He was Barbora Škrlova's father. During the whole court process, he was involved only once, and that was simply as a witness. And after that, the trial was over, Joseph Škrlova mysteriously disappeared from Czechia. And he indeed had a reason for this, as soon became known some very interesting details about himself. After the case gained sufficient publicity, it became known that long ago Barbara's father, Joseph Škrlova, was a member of a religious sect called the Grail movement. But the nuance was that even from this sect, whose rules were harsh or even cruel towards other people, Joseph was kicked out, even by their standards. He often overstepped the line, tried to manipulate other cult members to gain power, and when he couldn't manipulate someone, he resorted to threats. After being expelled from the Grail movement, Joseph created his own sect, the Ants. He managed to lure many away from the Grail movement, people into his sect, the Ants. These were mostly mentally unstable people, easily influenced. Joseph quickly gained connections, which helped him arrange for Barbara's adoption by Klara, even though it was almost legally impossible. And then, also thanks to his connections, he arranged Barbara's escape from the orphanage, first to Denmark and then to Norway. As you've probably already guessed, all the people mentioned earlier, Klara Mauer, Katerina Mauer, Barbora Škrlova, Jan Turek, Jan Škrlova, and Hanna Basova, were also participants, the sect of Ants led by Joseph. So if Joseph was behind all these tortures and abuses, what was his motive? The thing is that there are a number of very ambiguous facts in this story. When the police found the boy in the basement, they started recording everything that was there on camera. Seeing the camera, the boys livened up, started smiling, and generally behaved differently. This suggested the idea that someone had taught them to interact with the camera, to perform for it in a way. In Klara and Katerina's apartment, very expensive video equipment was found. Such equipment wasn't even sold in the Czech Republic, it was brought in from abroad. Several discs with recordings of the boys were found in the basement. And besides all this, 2 more apartments and 2 houses were rented in Katerina's name. The sisters clearly couldn't afford such expenses. So, what logical conclusion arises from all this? The recordings of abuse of children on camera were put on stream. Likely, these recordings were then sold to various sorts of perverts. Well, the most obvious conclusion is that Joseph Škrlova, a man who eventually fled and did not face any punishment, organized it all.